If you're going to pick a fight with a country that invented chess, you better know what the hell you're doing. And it's clear that Donald Trump has no idea what he's doing when he started a war of choice against Iran. That's where we're at today, where we are bogged down and the regime is panicking because they expected the Iranian regime to roll over just like many of the regimes and media entities rolled over for them when they took over. That's clearly not happening, and that's got the regime panicked. But to understand how we got here and how the Trump regime was so thoroughly outmaneuvered, we need to take a look back at the things that set the stage for the Middle East as it's constructed today. And to understand that, we need to understand what Nixon did during his tenure in office. And you might be thinking, what does Nixon have to do with this? I'll get to that later on in the conversation. But one of the key things that you need to think about when Nixon was in office was what he did with the US dollar. He detached it from gold, and when he detached the dollar from gold, countries all across the world asked the question, well, if it's not attached to gold, why should we continue to hold the dollar? And what Nixon faced was a currency crisis where people were abandoning the dollar for other currencies because the US no longer decided to have the dollar tied to gold. So what Nixon did at that time was he worked out an agreement with the Saudi royal family. And the agreement with the royal family consisted of two things. One, the House of Saud would sell oil and only accept dollars as the currency. That's the origin of the petrodollar. And other countries in the Middle East followed suit to the point where across the globe, the U.S. is the reserve currency based on the actions that Nixon took. What you have to understand with the global reserve currency being the dollar and oil being traded in dollars, there was an incentive for stability to be built across the region and for all of the oil producing states to hold the dollar and accept dollars as trade for oil. And that's been the global order since the Nixon era. That's how dollar dominance became a thing. And what happens is that other nations will buy our debt and hold dollars, which allows the dollar to appreciate, and it allows the US government to have a lot of flexibility in terms of what policies that they want to adopt when it comes to monetary policy and foreign policy. The other thing that this did was that because it wasn't anchored to any solid commodity, because it was decoupled from gold, it allowed the US to manipulate their currency in a way where they could rack up huge debts and then just print more money to erase that debt away. And that's been the pattern of behavior ever since the Nixon regime going forward. And that's why you've seen this boom and bust cycle throughout the decades. Whenever Republicans are in charge, there's always an economic crash that allows for quantitative easing of some sort or another that allows the elites to go ahead and buy up assets on the cheap. That's been the pattern of behavior. Now, what's that got to do with Iran? It's got a lot to do with what's going on in Iran. Now, over that time period, what you saw was various Middle Eastern states exchange that trade for oil in dollars and wrap around military and security guarantees as a result of that as well. So the U.S. was able to promise security to any number of Gulf and oil producing states in exchange for them trading oil in the dollar. And what you saw was U.S. military interests expand all across the Middle East in terms of bases, in terms of arms deals, in terms of security arrangements. This is basically the expansion of what Eisenhower had warned us about when he was talking about the military-industrial complex. So in the Middle East, you have a scenario where you have security arrangements, military trade deals, protection arrangements, and economic arrangements where trade is conducted in dollars that all create a web of dependency with the understanding that if any of those Gulf states were attacked, the U.S. would come to their defense. Now, with all of that context out of the way, what's happening today? Well, what's happening today and the situation that we find ourselves in as Americans is that you have a complete moron who is in charge, who thought that he could bully another country into submitting to him. He launched an attack when all of his advisors told him not to. He launched an attack against the advice of many of the people within his cabinet. He launched the attack under the urging of another country in the region who has had a 40-year mission to start a broader Middle Eastern war that would be the justification for that country to take over more real estate and more resources.
If not stopped, Iran could produce a nuclear weapon in a very short time. It could be a year, it could be within a few months.
They have the wherewithal, the stored up, preserved knowledge to make a bomb very quickly if they wanted to do it.
Iran is so dangerous. Weeks away from having the fissile material for an entire arsenal of nuclear bombs.
They're very close. They're 6 months away from being about 90% of having the enriched uranium for an atom bomb.
Iran is gearing up to produce 25 bombs, atomic bombs a year, 250 bombs in a decade.
Ladies and gentlemen, time is running out.
Iran will be capable of producing alone, without importing anything, nuclear bombs within 3 to 5 years.
This orange moron was manipulated into starting a war of convenience, thinking that the war would be over in a matter of hours. And what did we see since the launch of that war? What we saw was Iran apply the principles of chess to this particular engagement. Iran doesn't need to win this conflict. They just need to outlast and not lose. They can fight a war of attrition, and they know that the U.S. doesn't have any answer to decentralized defense tactics. So while the U.S. is taking out Iranian leaders left and right, Iran established the Mosaic defense, which allows for autonomous units all across their country and in international domains to launch attacks on their own without any instruction from a central leadership group. So instead of fighting one war, the U.S. finds itself fighting multiple wars on multiple fronts across multiple modes. And the first thing that the Iranians did when the U.S. launched their attack was that Iran launched all sorts of cheap drones at the Iron Dome, took out the infrastructure to support the Iron Dome, and that softened up the entire territory in the Middle East for attacks on infrastructure using more complex weaponry. The U.S. was not prepared for that. And neither were many of the countries across the Middle East where the U.S. has bases, because the Iranian attack wasn't focused on U.S. ships in Iranian waters. It was focused on military installations and military targets and infrastructure targets in and around all of the surrounding Gulf states where the U.S. had bases. And what did those attacks reveal to the leaders of those Gulf states? What it revealed was that the U.S. security arrangements don't mean anything when you're fighting an asymmetrical war against an enemy that's distributed all over the place and can act independently. Basically, the Iranian tactics of attacking the Gulf states that were aiding the U.S. poked holes in all of that advanced weaponry and made those countries realize how vulnerable they are to attack with or without U.S. presence nearby and with or without U.S. technology at hand. Because all of that technology has been decimated by the Iranian drone operation. The drunk in charge of the DOD and the moron in charge of the Oval Office both see this happening, and they can't quite figure out how it happened. And they've been caught completely unprepared. If that wasn't bad enough, the regime is now begging, pleading, and crying to NATO member states to send reinforcements into the region so that they can support the war of convenience that they started. And shocker, none of those countries are willing to lend a hand. And again, this regime is completely surprised by that reaction. That tells you how stupid the people in charge of the U.S. are. Let's understand what's been happening over the last 12 to 18 months. The morons in charge have been insulting, berating, belittling, and offending every ally possible. And they've been doing it through economic warfare. They've been doing it through rhetorical warfare. They've been doing it through threats of annexation. Anything and everything that you can think of this regime has done to strain all of our alliances. And now the U.S. finds itself completely alone in the Middle East and are surprised that nobody is running to their defense because of a war that they created unnecessarily. That tells you the lack of foresight and the lack of strategic thinking and the sheer stupidity of the people that are in charge right now. So what the U.S. finds itself in right now is they've entered into a war of convenience. They find very little in terms of allyship in the region. Their allied Middle Eastern countries that have their bases have all realized that U.S. security guarantees don't really mean anything against an enemy like Iran. Iran has rendered the technological might of the U.S. useless. And while all of this is going on, China is investing into Iran. Russia is offering military intelligence for Iran that's going to be leveraged against U.S. troops and service members in the region. And at the same time, Iran is waging an economic war against the U.S. by mining the Strait of Hormuz. And here's the masterstroke. Iran has said any country that isn't at war with us can go through the Strait of Hormuz with no problem. If you're at war with us, you aren't allowed to pass. And those countries that aren't at war with us, we're going to let you go ahead and travel through the Strait of Hormuz as long as you trade oil and exchange it for yuan. So China benefits as a result of that, and Russia benefits as a result of that as well, because anything that weakens the dollar strengthens Russia. And at the same time that all of this is happening, trading partners and U.S. allies have to make a decision. In order for us to continue doing what we want to do, we need to shift away from the dollar into the yuan, especially when it comes to oil, and we get free passageway. If we refuse to do that, we are in the same group as the U.S. and Israel, who have declared this war of convenience against Iran. This is what playing chess looks like, because any country that decides to continue trading oil in the dollar is an economic target for Iran and Iran's allies to attack. While all of this is going on, what's Trump doing? Trump is lowering sanctions on Russia while he knows that Russia is giving intelligence to Iran to kill U.S. troops. And this is the same Russia that had bounties on U.S. soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan during the first Trump regime. So Trump is playing the role of loyal puppet to his master Putin, making it easier for Putin to continue the war in Ukraine and also generate revenue from the sanctions that have been lifted. And at the same time, China is benefiting by supporting Iran and their ballistic missile programs and also getting currency dominance in terms of oil trades. What we're looking at is a catastrophic mess. And this regime and the idiots within this regime have painted the entire country into a corner. And we're going to pay the consequences for it because we made the cardinal mistake of electing these morons again and putting them into power. And the most ironic thing about all of this, the only country that is coming to our aid right now is Ukraine. The U.S. has been begging for support from all of the different NATO countries and asked Ukraine to lend their expertise when it comes to fighting against these drones, and Ukraine has agreed. And they're providing support. They're providing support after the orange idiot and his couch-defiling second in command berated, threatened, and embarrassed Ukraine's president little more than a year ago. That is the irony of ironies. And I'm surprised that Ukraine has been so willing to lend a hand after how their president was treated in the Oval Office. The simple fact of the matter is, Donald Trump and his regime of morons picked a fight with a country that's completely strategically outmaneuvered and economically outmaneuvered them at every step of the way. And now they're panicking because they can't figure a way out. They're talking about victory while asking for help. They're saying the enemy's destroyed while saying that the enemy can attack us at any moment. And they're trying to do whatever they can to, at the same time, escalate and escape a catastrophe of their own creation. When I've said that this is the dumbest regime ever to hold office in the history of the U.S., this is a perfect example of how stupid they are. And unfortunately, the people who are going to be paying the price are going to be the soldiers that are in the region and the average American citizen. So the next time you see someone walking around with those stupid red hats, make sure you let them know that you expect them to be volunteering to go out to the front lines. Because the rule going forward should be let the stupid die. And when we're talking about letting the stupid die, there's 77 million stupid people in 2024 that decided cheaper eggs was what they were going to vote for. And now they don't have cheaper eggs, they don't have cheaper gas, their kids are going to war, and the economy is in the crapper again. That's what you call stuck on stupid. Some people never learn.